I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example. We know here there's a sort of a 3 day cycle. Mostly, there's a 3 day cycle to a funeral. But I had an uncle died in Brighton a week before his 80th birthday, and he lay for 6 weeks in a mortuary, awaiting a place at a crematorium. And all I could think was his nearest and dearest, his children, his grandchildren, how do they begin to grieve? How do they begin to deal with that loss when they have this protracted 6 week period? It must have been nearly impossible for them. Whereas here, we have built things in to that grieving period that follows the death. We built things in where the community comes together and the community supports the family through the loss. And we have rituals that we go through which comfort the person. And it's often misunderstood by people who have not lived here or people who are not from a common culture with us. Um, Colum Sands, I'm sure many of you have heard of Colum Sands, the singer. Colum is a very lovely man and a great songwriter and a very astute observer. He's written a song called The Wake Song. And if you've ever heard it, he describes an Irish wake in all great detail, the way that any of us here would recognize it, except that in the room there's an Englishman who's never been at an Irish wake and he doesn't understand any of the things that are going on. And that thing that we do when we go into a wake house and we go to the usually closest relative of the deceased person, and without fail, we will say that same phrase that never becomes cliched, although it should. It never sounds trite, although it could. And we say it again and again, and we say this or some formulation of this. I'm sorry for your trouble. I'm sorry for your trouble. And it's a very, very particular thing to this part of the world. I'm sorry for your trouble. And if you imagine a funeral of a well-known person and a wake that's an open wake, which are becoming fewer and fewer these days. Wakes have decreased in number and in scale. But imagine hundreds of people visiting your house over 3 days. I have attended such wakes. I have been the nearest relative in such wakes. And that means that you hear this phrase possibly hundreds of times. And at no point does the bereaved person say, will you stop saying that? Please don't say that again. I've heard it 200 times. We accept it and it comforts us. It comforts us because we're being laid in the arms of a tradition, and it's a tradition which the community is sharing, and the community knows exactly what needs to happen. So when somebody dies here, we don't go into a panic and say, "Oh my word, what do I do first, or who do I need to contact, or what arrangements need to be made?" It's kind of built in, it's baked into us because we've done it like this for so long. So we know what has to happen. And somebody will arrive at the house with extra kitchen chairs. And somebody will arrive with an extra set of china, teacups, saucers, and side plates. And somebody invariably will arrive with a pot of soup or a pot of stew, or perhaps in these very cosmopolitan days, a lasagna or something, because we know that the nearest and dearest during that 3 day wake, they don't really eat. They live on sandwiches and buns and biscuits. And we know that self-care at that most vulnerable time is so important that somebody in the parish will be that person. In my parish, it's my wife, I have to tell you. As soon as somebody dies in the parish, our big saucepan, and it's this width, it's like a catering saucepan, it's this depth. I'm sure you could feed 50 people soup out of it. She's straight onto the stove and she's making a pot of stew or a pot of soup. And even if the people were not that close to us, out of respect for their memory and out of solidarity with those who are left behind, I will be sent to the house with this pot of stew or pot of soup. We have a strong tradition here where we do not leave the person who has died. We don't leave them alone. At least in a wake situation, we don't. It's different. I was at a funeral 2 weeks ago, and the man wasn't in the house at all. He was in a chapel of rest. So there was no wake where the deceased where you kept a vigil, which is what we call it in my community. And I was telling stories in uh, in Belfast at a gathering, and I told that exact anecdote. It's more of an anecdote than a story. And this lady at the end, people came around me with questions and with comments on things that I'd said and their own experiences. And it was just when COVID was just on the turn, where we were like starting to go out to supermarkets again, where we were starting to, venture beyond the back gate, but it was still there in the background. We were still frightened of it. And she came up and she said, I just wanted to come up and speak to you. And I said, well, no bother. What can I help you with? And she said, I lost my husband to COVID. And I said, I'm very sorry. I'm sorry for your trouble. And she said, I wasn't allowed near him in the hospital at all when he was sick. And in all the time he was on the ventilator, they never let me into the hospital. But when he died, I was allowed to go into the room. And then they couldn't get me out quickly enough. The nurses and the doctors, they were rushing me out of the room because of the risk of infection. And she says, I wouldn't leave the room. She said, I'm from a different community from you, but I couldn't leave the room. And she said, I never realized until I heard those words from your mouth that that's what I was doing, that I was keeping a vigil with my husband. And she says, you have just, opened up an entirely new way of thinking about death for me. And I just want to thank you. So I think that that runs very deep, that idea that goes back historically, where there's a period between death and ascending or descending, if that's the way you're going. There's a period in between those times. In our cultures on this island, it doesn't happen instantaneously. The moment of death was never considered the moment when the soul left the body. And in a wake house, there was one sure way to protect that period, and that was to keep a window open near the remains, and that was to allow the soul of the dead person to leave when they were ready. And of course, we can think of pragmatic reasons why in the 18th and 19th and early 20th century people wanted to leave a window open. We can think of sensible reasons for doing that. But the ritual part of it was that you had to keep the window open and you mustn't get between the person who had died and the window. You mustn't block their passage from the house in any way. And these things were rituals that were kept and adhered to religiously, and I mean that in the proper sense of the word religiously. They were followed without fail. So it's hardly surprising that as a storyteller, when I hear any wee snippet about funerals or deaths or wakes, even funny things, because we do have also a sense of black humor about death here, which I think is rather unusual in the world. I'll never forget, you must remember that awful atrocity on a beach in Tunisia when a madman machine gunned people on the beach. And a couple of months later, the Northern Ireland News, the BBC News, was doing a little segment about that. And they went to that resort. It destroyed the resort. It killed the resort stone dead. Nobody would go there. It was beautiful, paradise. But the beach was completely empty. All these hundreds of deck chairs lined up facing the water, all empty. And the reporter was walking up with a camera operator, and then they came across two deck chairs with two people sitting in them. The only two people on this whole vast beach. And the reporter said, we're doing a bit for the BBC News, and you know what happened here, don't you? And they said, oh, aye, absolutely, aye. And they said, and are you not afraid? Not at all. We're from Northern Ireland. Things like that don't frighten us. And these people were Northern Irish, and they were sitting on this beach of abject horror, this place that something terrible had happened. But they had a different approach to it because I think, as I said, it's baked into us. So that's where I'm going to be going tonight. I'm going to be talking a good bit about wakes and superstitions and rituals and things like that. But that's kind of my introduction. But before I do that, I know that a lot of you will know some of the characters I'm going to talk about, and I'm only going to mention them briefly, because Ballycastle has areas associated with death and deathliness, and of course we're great lovers of hauntings in Ireland. Although, as I said to my wife yesterday, I never heard of anybody seeing a ghost during the day in the supermarket. We only ever see them in really spooky places in the dark. And of course, that goes back to the time before electrification and street lights and house lights and things like that. And of course, if you were in a place where the infrastructure was poor and the roads were poor, and you were walking on mucky paths in the dark and the wind was blowing in the winter, of course, every sound you heard, you would, in your imagination, because we fear the unknown, you would turn it into some dreadful thing. So we hear the ghost stories of meeting the person who's been 3 days in the ground and speaking to them as they passed us in the road. I have experience of that. I know a person who that happened to. It's 100% testable. It actually happened. She met the person. She didn't know she was dead. Her father, however, knew that the woman was dead and said, "Oh, I doubt you weren't talking to her." And she said, "Dad, I know who I was talking to." And her name was Mary Margaret, by the way. She was like Bono and Madonna. She didn't require a surname. She was so well known here locally. He says, "You weren't talking to Mary Margaret, for Mary Margaret's 3 days in the ground." And this story, I heard it as a child, and I managed to trace it back to the actual person that it happened to. And she said, "Yes, it happened to me. No one ever believed me." But she met Mary Margaret 3 days after Mary Margaret had died. But do you know something? That exact same story crops up all over Ireland. There's not a county in Ireland, if you look into the folklore, that you'll find, for example, on Duchas, Duchas .ie, which is this repository of the Irish Folklore Commission. Every single county will have an encounter with someone who has already died. So I believe that Irish people have this approach to this moment of crossing over from one world to the next. And we were surrounded in Ireland, of course, with boundaries and places that crossed over from one place to the next. And boglands. Boglands were always boundaries. Bogland was a boundary between fertile, uh, fertile ground and forest. And a bogland was a really unusual place. And a bogland, it's like it's neither land nor water. So it's kind of liminal. It's in between these two places. And the other thing about bogland is that bogland in Ireland in the 14th, 15th, 16th century, bogland, Ireland was so heavily wooded that a bogland would have been the only place where you would have got a clear, uninterrupted view of the sky. And that made it a very important place for the people who lived here at that time, for they were sun worshipping people. And to see the sun in all its glory, if you lived in forest all your life, then to come across a bog was a great thing. And people would go to bogs and they would bury their dead in bogs, and they would bury gifts and presents and sacrifices and thanksgivings and things into the bog. So there have been all kinds of things found in the bogs of Ireland, including butter, which was completely preserved, totally preserved. Probably could have spread it in your bread. I wouldn't have been trying, but you probably could have. Also, alcohol was buried in the bog. Also, items of clothing were buried in the bog. But the thing that we know, thanks to archaeology and thanks to the poet Seamus Heaney, was people, because people were buried in the bogs. And it was a common thing to bury people on boundaries. So burying people on the boundary between baronies or town lands before baronies existed, or between fertile ground and bog, or bog and forest, a boundary was always considered a very important place because it fitted in with their worldview that there are two worlds in operation, the one that we experience bodily and the one that we know that's awaiting us, and the one that we know that's there, and the one that we know that if we're not careful, certain times of year, we can be pulled through into the other world. And we know those days. One of them is Samhain, the Halloween festival as it has become today. And you had to be careful on Samhain at night that you didn't step into any enchanted place, a fairy ring, a fairy rath, a fairy fort. You had to be cautious because if they caught you from the other world, they could pull you through and keep you. But the other time, it's coming up, it's not far away, and it's May Eve, the last night of April. And at that night, the veil between these two worlds was at its thinnest, and it was a very dangerous time to be abroad in the dark. And the people being pre-scientific, pre-literate, they had they had no other explanation for things that went wrong in their lives. If the crops failed, if the if you miscarried a child, if if you had a child with a disability, they had to rationally, like us, try to make sense of the world that they were in, and they appealed to the supernatural and they blamed things on the supernatural. So these bog bodies were supernatural. They weren't ordinary people. They didn't just bury every old person in the bog. And they have discovered that many of these people buried in the bogs were not only buried, but were ritually sacrificed and placed in the bog. And not only that, they were very often from the higher echelons of society. They were chieftains and kings in particular, people who were responsible for the community, people who had responsibility for the whole community and all its workings and all its life. So if the crops failed, people blamed the king, and the king would be sacrificed. And this was known to kings. Many of these bodies, uh, forensic pathology is able to tell us, these people didn't go against their will to their deaths. Many of them, when they looked in the contents of their stomach, they found that they had eaten maybe as many as 60 sloes from the hawthorn tree, and that their stomach also had undigested meal. They were given meal to eat, and these were sacrificial foods to be taken to the other side. And they had a way of dispatching people. They believed that a person needed to be killed three times. They had to be killed by stabbing, they had to be killed by drowning, and they had to be killed by burning. And kings were sacrificed to the bog and to the other world when things went wrong in a community. And they have found examples of now these people, it sounds like so they tortured these people by fire, by water, and by blade. No, there's usually one blow, there's usually one injury on the body, which was a fatal injury. So they were struck with a blunt object on the head and they were killed. And then post mortem, they were cut, they were exposed to water, and they were exposed to fire. And it seems that these people went more or less willingly to their deaths. So close was the relationship between this world and the other world. How, as a storyteller, could that not fascinate anybody? It just, it just to me jumps out as a thing that's that's so fascinating about the place that we live. And do we do those things today? We don't kill people like that. In 1895, a man called Michael Cleary believed that his wife had been taken away by the fairies and that she had been replaced with a changeling, which was the name they gave to the husk that looked like your wife but wasn't really your wife or your child or your husband. And the expression, he's away with the fairies, that's where it comes from. There was a widespread belief in Ireland that the fairies could come and take a human person to the other side and replace them with a changeling. It looks like you. Now, I often say to people, imagine today if I came home from work, if my wife came home from work and she found that I was not the same person that I was yesterday, I was altered, that my speech was disordered, or that my behavior was odd, or that my emotions were not under control, or that I had taken on a physical impairment. My wife's not going to come home and say, holy moly, my husband was taken away by a fairy in the night. My wife is going to say, my husband has suffered a stroke. My husband is having a psychotic episode. My husband is suffering from depressive illness. We have the language and the understanding today. But if in 1895, when Michael Cleary came home, his wife, Bridget, was altered. She wasn't the same person that he had gone to sleep with the night before. So he brought in 11 of his neighbors, 11, all men, and they proceeded to carry out the rituals for determining if Mary was a changeling or not. And that involved cutting her, burning her, hanging her, torturing her. And they tortured her for 4 days. And Mary died. Sorry, I'm calling her Mary. Her name was Bridget. Bridget Cleary. She died. She died after 4 days. He buried her in the bog out at the back of his house, and he thought nothing more of it. His wife had gone, but what could he do about it? Somebody went to the priest and told the priest what had happened. He went to the local constable, and the constable arrived at the house. He said, Michael, where's Bridget? And he says, oh, Bridget's away with the fairies. He says, Michael, did you bury Bridget somewhere? He says, well, the changeling's buried out the back there. I'll show you where it is. And he was taken and prosecuted. What was he prosecuted for? Murder? No. He was prosecuted with manslaughter because his defense was taken into account that he firmly believed that she was a changeling. Now you can imagine the newspapers at the time. The British press went to town on it. 1895, remember the Gaelic revival, the beginnings of Irish nationalism as we know it, that led over the next sort of 20 years to rebellion in Ireland. The British newspapers said these people are not fit for self-government. These people, how could we allow these people self-determination? These people still believe in witchcraft. And there was much made of the fact that Michael Cleary had killed Bridget. Michael was sentenced to 15 years. He served his full sentence. He was released from prison and he emigrated to Australia where he remarried and had a whole new life. And it was a well-known thing in the time that children in playgrounds would have sung, are you a devil or are you a fairy? Or are you the wife of Michael Cleary? You know, like skipping games and ball games. It was so widespread knowledge about this terrible thing that had happened. So we have this thing here about these two worlds colliding and the boundaries between them being slippery and us often falling from one end to the other. I want to take you to Bonamargy Friary briefly. Bonamargy Friary, just as you enter Ballycastle at the bottom of Glenchesque Road, and it's a ruined friary. Um, and its most famous inhabitants in its cemetery are Sorley Boy McDonnell, who was the leader of the Clan McDonnell, um, styled himself as his ancestors did as the Lords of the Isles, Scottish uh, warriors who eyed County Antrim from Scotland and laid claim to it by a tenuous sort of marriage delineation and said that he was entitled to it and basically came with his armies and tried to take over this part of Ireland. He wasn't met with no opposition. He had to fight the McQuillans. He had to fight the O'Neills. Sorley Boy McDonnell defied the statistics of the age between 1500 and 1700. The, the average life expectancy for a male in Ireland was 28 years. So a man could expect 28 years. Now, obviously, averages don't tell the full story because that included infant mortality. So the age was probably higher. But he lived till he was 85. 85 must have been incredibly old in 1590 when he died. But Sorley Boy warred against the McQuillans, and he courted favour at the English court with Queen Elizabeth and with before her James IV of Scotland, James I, and he sometimes had the support of the English against the McQuillans, and he sometimes didn't. And he engaged in many, many battles. He was captured, he was imprisoned in Dublin Castle, and he lived out this incredible life. But in 1575, the Earl of Essex gave the order to attack Rathlin Island. Rathlin Island was a very treacherous island to land a ship on. The tides and the rocky coastline made it a very difficult place to attack. So it would be a fairly safe place to send people, excuse me, it would be a fairly safe place to send people if you wanted them protected. And he had sent, in the midst of one of these awful turmoils of battles that he was engaged in, all his sick, his elderly, his children, his wealth, his silver, and also he was the lord of many other Scots leaders, and they also sent their families to Rathlin for safekeeping. And Francis Drake was dispatched by the Earl of Essex, Sir Francis Drake as he became, to attack Rathlin and to kill everyone on the island. And Rathlin had a castle which was manned by 200 soldiers, and Francis Drake sailed up the coast of Rathlin. He had on board an army, military force led by John Norris, and they shelled the castle from the ocean. Now, I checked this out today. From Fairhead to Rathlin Island is 2.25 miles as the crow flies. If you're standing on Fairhead, you can see what's happening on Rathlin. And it's said that Sorley Boy McDonnell stood on Fairhead watching Rathlin be massacred, and it was massacred. They shelled the castle until the castle surrendered. Norris landed his men. They took the surrender of the constable of the castle in exchange for the constable's freedom and his family and servants. Massacre everybody else was the order. So they did. They killed every man, woman, and child on the island. And they killed the other 200 soldiers who were not the constable's family. So there was a massacre of 600 people. People were reputed to be throwing themselves off cliffs, hiding in caves with children. They were hunted down and they were killed. And I mean, in modern times, we think of, I mean, we have very recent experience in our heads of shock tactic massacres out of the blue, things that weren't expected and about the scale of things. But remember that the population of Ireland was tiny. So to like 600 600 Irish and Scots people on the island of Rathlin to be massacred, that's gigantic scale of loss when you take into account the population of Ireland. And it was only by chance that I came across the story that happened 342 years later when HMS Drake, a heavy cruiser or a battle cruiser in World War One, 1917, was escorting a convoy from America, and they cut across the north, sailing past Rathlin when they were torpedoed, and they weren't sank immediately or sunk immediately, but they were damaged so badly that they put into Rathlin, and men died in the deck that had been struck by the torpedo. Many of the men were saved and they were taken off in Rathlin, and the wreck is now the most dived wreck in the British Isles. And it's a war grave because it was decided those who had perished were to be left there. And of course, the ship was called HMS Drake, and it was called the Revenge. It was Rathlin's Revenge. That it was mentioned that there was a connection between Francis Drake destroying, massacring the people of Rathlin in 1575, and then this ship being sunk and people perishing. So it's an interesting thing to think of Sorley Boy standing there. Apparently, he stood on Fairhead, jumping up and down with rage. There are recorded evidences of somebody watching him, pulling his hair out by the roots as he watched Rathlin destroyed in front of his eyes. And he's buried in Bonamargy. In Bonamargy, there's a very famous grave, the grave of Julia McQuillan. And the McQuillans were the lords of Dunluce, and the McQuillans were a powerful chiefdom. And Julia was a nun, and she she stayed in Bonamargy, and she died in Bonamargy, and it's said that she haunts Bonamargy. And we like a good haunting here. We like this concept that somebody might be reaching over from the other side. And Julia was very famous because in her lifetime she made prophecies. She prophesied that two great stones would come together, and she named the places which were impossible places for these two stones to come together. But when Ballycastle Harbour was rebuilt, in fact, these two stones were quarried and they were brought and they were put together in Ballycastle Harbour. She also prophesied horseless carriages. This is in the this is in the uh, 1700s, and she was prophesying horseless carriages. She also said that they would draw water from Knocklade Mountain and it would flow to Ballycastle. It does, in fact. And she prophesied that a red-haired priest would drown after saying Mass in Murlock Chapel. And she named the place where he would drown. And indeed, there was a priest with red hair who said Mass in Murlock and went for a swim and drowned off Ballycastle. So I think her prophecies can be taken a bit like Nostradamus. It's like we can almost make anything fit a prophecy, but people put a lot of store by her prophecies. And indeed, we have horseless carriages and iron ships. She also predicted the stones from Barnish and Carnduff came together in the harbour. The red-haired priest did die. We did have iron ships, and so on and so on. But when she died, she asked to be buried in the entrance to the friary, at the door to the friary, as a sign of humility, because she wanted everybody entering the friary and leaving it to walk over her mortal remains. And that's where she was buried. And the evidence for where she's buried today is a Celtic cross with a hole through the centre of it. Um, and the spars of the cross are no longer there. It's more or less a circular stone. And it's said that if you walk round that at night, anti-clockwise 7 times, and then clockwise 7 times, the Julia McQuillan will appear. A paranormal investigator called Stephen McKinley came over. He was a County Antrim man to begin with, and he came to investigate the haunting at Bonamargy Friary, and he brought his paranormal equipment and his recording devices and so on, and he didn't manage to record anything. He thought he lived in London, but County Antrim was his home. When he got back to London, he took his audio recording equipment out one night to record a thunderstorm, and as he played the tape that he had recorded in Ballycastle, he heard voices on the audio tape, and he also heard monks singing in like Gregorian chant, that stereotype of monks at prayer and singing the prayers. And he claims to have heard it on the tapes, and he has it on the tapes. So it's a very haunted place, the North Coast. And to me, those things, Julia McQuillan and Sorley Boy and the people on Rathlin, those are more examples of how brutish and brutal life was for the people of this island. That you could go 2 centuries where life expectancy was 28 years old. But it got worse. There was a period in 1845 where life expectancy for males in Ireland fell, and I'm going to share an image with you here. I'm not, it seems. Um, the image is a graph of life expectancy in Ireland since 1845 up until 2015. And you've got this dip, this grave dip in 1845. And of course, we know that those were the years of famine, and that was the years when infant mortality would have been at its highest, when death in childbirth would have been at its highest, when death from starvation, from injury, from accident, from disease, when they were at their highest. There were outbreaks of cholera, there were outbreaks of consumption or tuberculosis. So I have this belief that people, when they finished their day, they got down on their knees and they thanked God for having made it through another day because life was so tenuous, and they were clinging on up until 1845. And that's still in the folk memory of the people here. In my house, growing up as a boy, I'm 59 almost, and we grew up, and my mother very often would have baked famine bread. Famine bread was yellow meal bread, and yellow meal bread is made from corn, it's made from maize flour. And it's in the folk memory that that arrived in Ireland from America as a donation for the relief of starvation during the famine. And it became known at some point in my grandmother's 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 time, it became known in our family as famine bread. So in my house, it's still called famine bread. So we're very slow to let go of things here. Things stay in the folk memory and in the myth and in our folklore. They stay there for a very long time. So I'm going to tell you a story. We've got Fairhead. We're at Bonamargy, and if you walk up the glen from Bonamargy, you'll be walking up Glen Shesk. And of course, there was a very terrible battle in Glen Shesk that Sorley Boy was involved in. And Glen Shesk, imagine the 19th century. Imagine a farmer on one side of Glen Shesk, and on the other side, his sister. She's married to a farmer over there. Now, this farmer, let's call him John Butler. John Butler's a widow. His wife has been taken away by the fever, and he's trying to raise 3 children. And he wouldn't have the parish talking about him, so he does his best to keep them clean and to keep the elbows in their ganzies and to keep their shoes clean and to keep them fed because he wouldn't have the people of the parish saying, "Look at that boy, he hasn't taken care of those children since his wife went at all. Look at the state of that family." So he lived in a wee cottage there with his 3 children and his mother. His mother was what we used to call an invalid. She wasn't very mobile, but she could help round the house. And when he was out working about the farm, she could look after the children at least. And he got up early this morning, very early for him, and he went and he fed the sheep, and he brought the heifer in from the far field to the meadow near the house, and he filled 3 straw baskets with turf, and he got the children up and washed and dressed and ready for school. And then he looked across the glen to his sister's house, and he saw smoke coming out of the chimney, and he knew that there was people there and they were up and about. And he knew why, because his sister's husband had died, and there was a wake. It was a wake house. During the night, it's called a wake house. During the day, it's called a funeral house. But during the night, we call it a wake house. And he was going to have to make his way over there because today was the final day. Today, his mortal remains would be taken away to the cemetery and they would be buried. But he wanted to be there before the remains left the house, and he had reason to do so. So, having done all the chores and left everything ready for his mother, he set off walking, and he walked across the glen, and he had to walk round um, the bottom of the mountain, and he had to walk up, and he reckoned that it would take him about an hour to walk from the one house to the other. So he gave himself an hour and a half, and he set off, and he had a fair sweat on him walking over there, but he did. And when he arrived, the the yard was filled with people, for his brother-in-law had been a well-liked man, and the priest was just arriving, and the priest put his stole on round his neck, and he called for a tin bucket with water in it, and they brought him a tin bucket, and he made the sign of the cross over it, and it was holy water, because that's all holy water is. It's water that's been blessed. And somebody reached him a whitewash brush. Every house had a whitewash brush, and he dipped it in the water, and he scattered this water over the people in the yard who had their heads down and their hands joined. Now, John knew that before he went into the house, he knew exactly what to expect. He knew that the window would be open near his brother-in-law's remains. He knew that his brother would be lying on the table, because this was at a time before undertakers, before professionalism of death had taken place in Ireland. He knew that he'd be lying there. He'd have been washed, he'd have been shaved, he'd have been dressed in his best clothes, and a wake would have taken place around him. He knew the number of people that would have passed through the house over the previous 2 nights because he was a well-known man. Hopefully I can share this one with you, because there was a there was a pattern to it. I'm hoping everybody can see there a shopping list. Can you nod if you can see that? Yes. I'll make it bigger for you in a second, but as long as that's what you're looking at. This is a shopping list from 1912, and it's a wake shopping list. And the shop is an ironmonger and seedsman and grocer. And just look at the items. And I have to tell you, I've seen a number of these, and they're almost identical. As soon as somebody died, the grocery list, they called it the wake provisions. It was written out and it was sent to the grocers or whatever the local supplier was. And it didn't matter if you hadn't the money there and then, they would wait. They would, nobody would be affronted into not affording a wake. And if you look on it here, we have two gross of pipes. This is clay pipes. They're 3 and 10, 3 shillings and 10 pence for a gross. That's 144. So two gross is 288 clay pipes at the price of 7 shillings and 8 pence. 3.5 pounds of tobacco at 4 and 6 a pound, 4 shillings and sixpence a pound. 4 stone of bread, 2 pounds of tea, 1.5 pounds, I'm assuming that is, of sugar. And then the rest of it is really, really peculiar because it is candles, creamery butter, snuff, half an ounce of snuff. And then look at the bottom ones. They're a bit harder to read. 12 boards, 14 foot 11 by 1, 12 boards, sorry, that should have been 4 foot 11 by 1. And then the same number of boards, 2 foot 9 by 3 quarters. And then slats. This is mounting slats. And then after that, it's nails and tacks. They basically were buying the food for the week and they were buying the makings of the coffin. And this was a very, very common thing in Ireland. This list was duplicated up and down the country. Tobacco and snuff were very important, and they were very important because as his brother was waked, John knew that every single man who entered the house would be reached a clay pipe pre-filled with tobacco by a male relative of the deceased. And it didn't matter if you didn't smoke, you had to take a pipe because it was part of the ritual where you would sit in the room with the dead person and you would inhale on the pipe and you would say, "Oh dear, oh, he was a good soul. Oh, boys, he wasn't a bad old fella." And this was a ritual that happened right up until the turn of the 20th century. The clay pipe was still very common. But 288 pipes, that's a lot of people over 3 days. Snuff was for the ladies. Ladies weren't expected to smoke pipes, and at night, ladies were given snuff, and snuff was an inhalable form of tobacco, and it was considered more ladylike to take snuff. That list doesn't have alcohol on it because some wakes were dry, depending on your faith and on your beliefs, but some wakes were definitely not dry. He knew that that house was not a dry house, and he knew that a lot of drink would have been taken. Porter and whiskey for the men, wine and sherry for the ladies. And alcohol was only produced at night. You weren't given alcohol during the day. During the day, you drank tea and you ate bread and butter and jam. That was common fare for a wake. So John knew all this would be going on, and he also knew that in the house, every reflective surface, picture, mirror, anything that might reflect your face back at you was covered in black cloth because he knew that the people feared that there was a risk if they walked past a mirror, they would see the spirit of the dead person reflected in the mirror. I said away at the beginning, I think there was always there was a practical reason for superstitions. I think for a recently bereaved person, like a widow, to see herself in the mirror would remind her that she was now alone. And I think that it was more to spare the feelings of the people behind, that they were not looking at an image of themselves alone in the world. So I've been at funerals where every reflective surface has been covered in black cloth. He knew that the horse and cart that would arrive to take the body would be turned round in a circle 3 times in the front yard. And that was for the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And he also knew that if he didn't get into the house before they lifted the body off the table, something dreadful could happen. Because what happened was, as soon as the body was lifted from the table, the young men of the parish would jump up on the table, they would turn it over sideways, they would knock it upside down, they would scatter the chairs round the kitchen. It was a practice known as turning the tables. He also knew that the women of the parish or the women of the family, they would be in the bedroom of the deceased and they would be doing a thing they called breaking the bed. Now, they weren't literally breaking the bed, but they would have thrown the mattress off the bed. They would have turned the bed upside down. They would have distressed every piece of anything in the room. And the reason why these two practices happened, turning the tables and breaking the bed, was because there was a belief that if they did these rituals, then the next death to visit that family would be on a different branch of the family. Now, since he knew that it was his brother-in-law who was dead, the next branch of the family was his. He'd lost his wife a year ago. His mother wasn't well. He'd 3 small children to bring up. He could not afford to allow the young men of the parish to turn the tables. So he went into the house just as they were about to lift the deceased off the table, and he vaulted up onto the table and he stood up and he put his two fists up and he said, "Let one of you try, let one of you come near." And the young men of the parish, they were like wild animals. They were staring at him, their nostrils were flared, and they were weighing up the likelihood of overpowering him against any injury that they might suffer themselves. And they decided that discretion was the better part of valor, and they backed away. He stayed on the table until he heard the horse and cart leave through the gate, and then he knew it was safe to come down, and he knew that he had saved his children, his mother, and himself, at least for this time. And that's a story I call Turning the Tables, very widespread practice in Ireland at wakes. I'm aware we're coming up to the hour, Joanne, and I have uh, I have one or two wee things. This business of laying the corpse out on the table, which was so widespread, the kitchen table was a multi-purpose piece of furniture. People weren't squeamish about things like that. This is why we have the superstition against leaving shoes on a table. So in my house growing up, certainly if you'd left new shoes on a table, my mother would have gone clean daft because the only time you should see shoes on a table is on a corpse. And the superstition has come down to us from that. And also the tradition, the horse and cart and taking the person's body to the cemetery, it was always believed that it was good if it rained in the funeral procession. And they say happy is the coffin that the rain falls on. And if you think about it, in Ireland, there's not that many days. I mean, I know we're in the middle of climate change and things, but go back to your childhood, it rained a lot. And I have to say, most deaths were winter deaths. You know, winter took its toll. Winter's taken its toll this year. Winter took its toll, and there would have been rain on many's a coffin, and it would have been a way for people to say, do you know what? This thing that we experienced again, at least the rain fell on the coffin. It means it was a good funeral. And that's that's more or less where we are. We still say to people, I'm sorry for your trouble. And every time I say it, I never feel the slightest embarrassment about how many times somebody has said it before. And I know that in the house the clock might be stopped. And the clock might be stopped because can you imagine two gross of pipes, 288 men, each one of them saying, and what time did he die at? To the widow. Can you imagine? So the simplest thing was just to stop the clock at the moment of their death. And then that did away with the need for that question. So it was a quite practical thing. I'm going to leave you with one little anecdote, and that is I had an uncle died. I was estranged from my father at an early age, but his family kept in touch with me. He was one of 21 children. He had 20 siblings. And every now and again, my sister and I and my brother, we would get a phone call to go to Carrickfergus because another one of that generation had passed away. And I went into the funeral, into the wake house. And the minute I went in the wake, the widow saw me, screamed, and ran out of the room. And the whole room turned and looked at me, maybe 30 or 40 people, and silence. And I thought, holy, what have I done wrong? And somebody came and said, Stephen, would you like to come and see your Uncle Kenny? Because this is another thing we do at the funeral. This ritual of coming and looking at the dead person's remains and very often passing comment on it, like, doesn't he look well? Isn't he wild like himself? You know, I saw him a couple of weeks ago and he didn't look a bit well, but I think seeing him there the night, he looks great. So we had to do these things. And I went down and I looked into the coffin. What did I see looking back out of the coffin? Myself. We were so alike. My hair was prematurely white. His hair was white in the normal course of time, and we looked like each other. So when I walked into the room, she thought she was seeing an apparition. And they brought me back into the room, and when they finally got her calmed down, she came in. She sat holding my hand for the next 3 hours. She couldn't take her eyes off me because I looked so much like my Uncle Kenneth. So I think that the customs of wakes and funerals and rituals and things like that, I think they're alive and well. Apparently, wakes are making a comeback. I was reading somewhere where undertakers said that it was down to as low as 2 in 10 families would have had a wake where the remains were in the house, but that now that's up to 4 or 5 out of 10. So I think I'm looking forward to my wake. I want to have a nice wake. And I'm leaving no instructions. I'm just going to tell the children whatever gets you through those 3 days, whatever makes you calm, whatever stresses you the least. I'm not leaving uh, any directions about how they do it. I'm just looking forward to it. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed my talk and my stories. Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you very much, Stephen.
thank you, Stephen. I'm
Thank you
sure we
very
all
much.
will agree that it was well worth running over the 45 minutes and that. Um,
Thank you.
Funny you're saying about the shoes on the table. My late grandmother would have cracked up. I
Aye.
came in the other night and one of the daughters had bought shoes and hadn't she the box sitting on the table. And of course I nearly cracked up. So now I know where it comes from.
Mhm.
So every day's a learning day. So look,
Well,
folks, thanks for bearing with us and the extra time. Has anybody any quick questions for Stephen before we go?
yes,
No
Peter.
questions, but very enjoyable, Stephen.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Not a
That's
question,
Thomas.
not a question, but an observation. I
Okay.
did, I did notice behind you, Stephen, the stop clock. Don't want to alarm you, or is that part of the theatrical setting?
I took the battery out of the clock, Peter, before I started the Zoom.
Could I say?
But the beauty of that clock is it's right twice a day. Yes,
Could I
Leslie.
say? Could I say? I come from County Westmeath,
All
and
right.
um, I I remember hearing. I think it. I'm sure it was right that the bishop had to stop the practice of wakes because
That's
they
right.
got totally out of control,
That's
and they
correct.
did terrible things to the. They would organize that the body would suddenly leap up
Yes,
out of the
that's true.
coffin, and
That's
it
true. That's true. And
so.
worse, that's worse. When drink was
Mhm.
taken, they would take the body and dance around the room with it. They would put pipes in its mouth. There are some terrible accounts of things
Yeah,
that
but the
I wouldn't have
bishop
wanted
banned
to
it anyway.
distress people with. But the thing that was banned really by the church was wake games, because a wake was also an occasion for play and games. And there were all kinds of games played, including one that was called mock trial. And you put somebody on trial who had committed a social injustice during the year. They'd maybe cheated you on a deal, or they had uh, stolen a foot of ground off you, or something. So at the next wake, they were put in trial, and there was a judge and there was a jury, and they were stood on a straw basket, and a rope was placed around their neck, and there were two deaths when the basket collapsed beneath the person, and then widows, particularly widows, would put in the death notice in the paper, no wake games. And if it was no wake games, the young men of the parish boycotted the funeral. They boycotted the wake because the wake games were a big part of the social release that took place at a wake and at a funeral. It was also an opportunity for young men to meet young women and for young women to meet young men. And it was also an opportunity to get to play games that there was always somebody picked on nearly in the game. It would be somebody who was disliked or somebody who was dishonest. There was a game called Slaps, and it was the commonest game played at wakes. All the men stood in a circle, and they put their right hand behind their back, and they had to strike the left hand of the man beside them as hard as they could, and it would go round the circle. And it was a game of strength and endurance, and eventually men would drop out with pain, and it would end up with two men standing, slapping each other on the hand until blood was drawn and bones were broken, and only when one of them gave up could the game be called. And those kind of things, the church frowned on them very, very seriously because it was profane. This was a sacred time of, it was a sacred time of for the parish. It was a sacred, holy time. Prayers were being said during the day, and the rosary was being said. And here's these people in drink playing games, tests of strength and endurance, and people died. People actually died from mock trials. So yeah, you're right. The church didn't like wakes. They really didn't, because they were a thing of the people. They were like carnival for the people. You know, Kevin.
Stephen, just thanks very much. That was fantastic. I thoroughly enjoyed that.
Thank
It
you.
was more an observation. I had to attend 2 wakes here last year in
Right.
Glasgow,
Yes.
and they did it very different. So they were originally from West Donegal. It's a place where I would spend a good bit of time. But they
Okay.
actually sat with the corpse or with the body all night,
Oh,
which is not something that I was ever familiar with here in the Glens.
I know we certainly do it here.
Yes, no?
We keep a when my mother was 80 when she passed. She's dead 6 years, but we kept a vigil. She was not left alone at any moment. And the truth is that a lot of these games and enjoyments that people did, it was to keep people awake through the night. It was really to keep people awake because there was a 24-hour vigil. You had to stay awake beside, if I was the last person in the room, I couldn't leave the room till somebody came in to let me out. So I mean, and there's eight in my family, and my mother's request was that her funeral would be house private. So there was just really the eight of us and our partners and wives and husbands and so on. And we kept the vigil all through the night. Absolutely. It's still, I mean, wakes are diminishing in number, but where wakes happen, that vigil still happens. In my experience, absolutely. And if you ask anybody, who's staying up tonight, they'll be able to tell you, well, I'm taking the first shift, and Seamus is on after me, and then Francis is doing the last. Excuse me, the last. So we still do that here. Yes, absolutely. Um, I think pop folklore says that that's to make sure that the person's actually dead. And we hear that, I've heard that before. It's nonsense. The word wake, it means we're going to hold a party and make enough noise to wake the dead. Nothing to do with that. But there was a fear, particularly in the 1900s, there was a fear of premature burial. And we know that people did fall into catatonic, states, and that we know there were people buried alive. There was a man woke up in a mortuary somewhere in England, in a mortuary with a tag on his toe and the sheet over his head, and the orderly went and opened those long doors you see in Silent Witness, and the man was alive and well. He'd been certified dead. We know it happens. So people had glass windows sometimes put in their coffin so that as you lowered them into the grave, if your eyes were moving, they could see you. And the expression "saved by the bell" was people who had a bell incorporated on a string inside the coffin. And if they suddenly came alive again, they could ring the bell and the people would know. And that's where we get the expression being saved by the bell. So, yes, wake customs, of course, they differed from county to county and district to district, but there's a general kind of similarity to the way that we approached it. And I think it goes way back into those Bronze Age times, those boundaries, this this belief that there's two worlds in operation. I think it goes back to that.
I have to say, if Kevin describes himself as a carry man, and he wasn't aware of the ritual of staying up all night with the remains. That is a common practice in Carry. We did it for my father, although he was a Ballycastle man, but my mother was a Carry woman, and it was
Right.
she who decided who would stay up the night before the burial. I didn't get to bed for something like 48 hours.
Right. Yeah. No, I have lots of experience of doing that, because the other thing that happens is you get a person in a family. I think I was always destined to be a storyteller with an interest in death, because all my adult life, when the undertaker comes into the house, there's usually a male senior person in the house becomes the liaison between the family and the undertaker. That was me from I was like 23 or 24. I was the guy that was, you know, in touch with the Undertaker all the time. So so I think I might have participated in wakes more than the average person, you know. But imagine, like, those two statistics, mortality of 21 years, and for 200 years the average mortality for males was 28. How many funerals and wakes would you have attended if people were dying so young? If people were dying that young, death was such a commonplace thing to those people that they were like the Northern Irish tourists on the Tunisian beach. It's like death. Sure, death's just part of life. I think it's what makes it uniquely Irish, the way that we have of dealing with this period between death and burial, and the way that we have of beginning that process of grieving. All those wee rituals that we have, I think that it's all part of that. I've really enjoyed chatting with everybody. Does anybody else have a point or an observation or a criticism or a do you want to deny something I said? Or I have had people. I told a story one time of Finn McCool, and a tourist came up and said, actually, you know that Finn McCool, and he started to tell me the story of Finn McCool, me, a Glensman, steeped in the tradition. And he'd been told the story for free. He was in my cafe in Cushendun. I had a cafe, and I told stories. And I mean, all I could think was, hold on a minute, you're in my cafe, you're getting a free story, and you're coming up here to tell me about Finn
Real
McCool. Go way on with you. So I'm quite happy to take, if people say, well, actually, I disagree with you on that, or I don't think that it happens like that, or as I say to people at the start, I'm not a historian. I'm a storyteller who loves history, but I don't get bogged down in the minutiae um, of dates and historical perfection. I don't get bogged down in that. Storytellers don't need that. So I hope you've enjoyed tonight. And is this the first of four, did you say, Joanne?
This is actually the first of 5,
The
Stephen.
first of five. Oh,
So
well.
I was going to give a wee plug for next week.
Okay, cool.
It's on Wednesday night next week, and Dr. Niall Cromer will be joining us with the place names of Ballycastle and the Causeway Coast. So Dr. Cromer is a lecturer in Irish and Translation Studies at Ulster University's Magee campus, with a particular interest in the origin of townland names. And he runs a couple of Facebook pages, one of which is the Gaelic heritage of the Causeway Coast and Glens, with sort of thousands. So there is obviously a big interest. So it should be another one well worth tuning into.
People will get the link. People will just apply through museums.
Everyone who has registered so far will receive the links. So they will.
Right.
It's on Wednesday, did you say?
It's on Wednesday evening next week, the 7th. Same time, 7:30. But we'll be sending out the link. Because of the Wednesday night, we didn't do it as a recurring. So we'll send out the link but for Wednesday night, and then you'll all receive them the following week for the last 3. But we have a really varied programme over the next 5 weeks. But as I say, Stephen, thank you for getting us off to a cracking start. You'll be a hard act to follow.
No problem. No problem.
So you will. Thank you to everybody for bearing with us. Well, we did.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Over.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.